it's Mo. It is mid-November. That means it's time to start my TBRtackle book for November, but actually I already started it in the beginning of the month. Usually I don't read my TBRtackle book until the end of the month, but since this was a collection of short stories and essays, I wanted to get a jump on it. If you don't know what TBRtackle is, it is a super fun booktube game created by Kieran at Katie Books. It started in the beginning of 2022 and it runs to the end of 2022. In the beginning of 2022, we all picked 12 books. Each month, Kieran's friends make a prompt for us to follow that may or may not change the books that we originally picked. We pick one book following the prompt and read it in that month, and then at the beginning of a new month, there is a new prompt. We are now in the penultimate month, second to last month of TBRtackle. I, for one, sincerely hope that Kieran decides to continue this challenge into 2023, but I also sincerely doubt he will because he doesn't seem to really enjoy it that much. It has been one of the best parts of 2022 on booktube for me, so I hope that TBRtackle will continue for many years to come. I vlog all my TBRtackle books, and you can always see how I picked my next book at the end of each video. So if you want to see how I picked Vampires Never Get Old, you can go back to my October video. Vampires Never Get Old is a collection of short stories and essays all about vampires and a new take on vampire tales. So it says Tales with a Fresh Bite. It was edited by Zoraida Cordova and Natalie C. Parker, and they also have a combined short story in this collection. There's a lot of different authors in here, including Donnell Clayton, Samira Hamid, Rebecca Rowanhorse, V.E. Schwab, and these are all takes on the vampire mythos, but with a modern or current look at what those mythos mean today. The stories are pretty short, usually between 10 and 20 pages, and then at the end of each story there is a little essay from the editors about why they liked that story, why they picked it, and how it pertains to the overall vampire mythos and literary history of vampires. Something that I didn't realize when I picked up this book, although I don't know how I didn't realize this, is that these are all stories for young adults. I should have known by the price tag on the back of the book, or I should have known because of what these authors are known for writing, but for some reason that didn't occur to me. So every story that I've read so far is pretty much about teenagers or in some way related to coming of age or growing up, which makes a lot of sense in vampire mythos in general. I did actually start this in the beginning of November because I've been slowly working my way through it. One of my issues with short story collections in general is that I can't read them like back to back, one right after the other, or I won't remember what the stories were about. They won't be distinct stories to me. They will all just blur together. So I've read like basically one a day for a little over a week, and then I stopped for a while to finish other books, and now I'm ready to go back to it, so I wanted to make sure to talk to you before I move on. I also happened to be at the story that was by the editors. I got this copy at a used book sale. It's signed by one of the editors and one of the authors, which is just really cool. Since the beginning of October, I'm actually also working on like a short story project. So you'll see a video about that later in the year, and I'm going to include this book because it's short stories in that video, but I'm not going to talk about them in depth there, so you can definitely hear my more in-depth thoughts here. I don't really know how to talk about short story collections because I don't usually read them, so this will be an interesting test. So the introduction was like the first of the short essays. The essays are like only half a page long and the introduction is only a page. It just kind of tells about like why they were interested in vampires, and because vampire myths are mostly told by men and old, white men at that they really wanted to update those ideas and see what young, diverse authors could bring to the vampire genre. The first story also is signed. by Tessa Grattan, and this is 7 Days for Dying. It was the first story. It was the first story I read, and it definitely gave me an inkling that this was actually a young adult book. It's about a teenager who meets a vampire through her artwork. She sells her art at a cafe, and a vampire comes to meet her, and he tells her that he wants to turn her. This story explains what her thought process is and if she wants to become a vampire or not. I at first really didn't like this story, but I ended up enjoying it by the end. I thought that one of the interesting things about it was that the human was given a choice in becoming a vampire, which is something you don't often see in kind of the vampire canon. Usually people don't really get a choice, or if they have a choice, it's not really explained what the consequences of becoming a vampire are. The Boys from Blood River by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is the first Rebecca Roanhorse I've read, and it definitely made me want to read more of her work. This is about a young Native American boy who is ostracized from his town. He's an outsider, he's bullied, partly because of the color of his skin and partly because he is queer. There is a myth in his town about calling on the Boys from Blood River to solve all your problems and change your life, and although he thinks it's just a story, he's so ready to become a different person and lead a different life that he's willing to give it a try. I really liked this one. It's a little bit longer than the other stories that I've read so far, and it has a little bit more character development. He was given a choice in some ways to whether to become a vampire or not, or to allow the things that vampires have to do or not, but in a lot of ways he also was given a false promise or a monkey's paw type of situation. This one just went in an interesting direction. The next story is Senior Year Sucks by Julie Murphy, and this is a play on the Slayer myth as well as the vampire myth. And it follows a young teenage girl who has been born into a Slayer lineage and what she does when she meets a vampire who is not what she expects. So this one was cool because it definitely does play with the idea of good and evil and is a creature of the night, a vampire inherently evil, or can they retain some of their humanity? The next story is actually a historical fiction, and it is called The Boy and the Bell by Heidi Helling. This has trans representation and is about a young man who wants to change his station in life and wants to become a doctor. Because of his upbringing and his poor status, he's not easily able to get into any kind of medical school, so he turns to grave robbing to help him get a leg up, so to speak. This one was probably my least favorite. I didn't love any of it really, although I thought that using a historical fiction teenage character was interesting and where in time that character was. I also did think that this one had a few interesting historical tidbits, like people putting different things in coffins because they thought people were wrongly entombed, put in their coffins when they were still alive. I liked, of course, that there was trans representation, and there was a lot of confronting elements in that where people were dead naming or dead gendering the person, and that was interestingly upsetting to read about. But overall, I totally forgot about this one. The next story in this book is a guidebook for the newly sired Desi vampire by Samira Amid. This one has a little bit of mixed media, and we start the story waking up as a vampire looking at a phone app to be a guidebook for newly sired vampires. It takes place in India, and it definitely has a lot of Indian language and slang and reference to Indian food and Indian culture, and that part was super interesting. Although it was done in this very tongue-in-cheek, flippant way, the whole story was written that way, and I really didn't enjoy that. This is one of the stories that I didn't really like. I did think it was an interesting idea that technology would change how vampires were created and how they were raised and what their personalities might be, and again, that struggle between good and evil, what those potentials are. A guidebook also had a lot of reference to like colonization and how those things affect vampires. So how colonization, racism, and other things like that also have an effect on the undead. That part was really interesting. Overall, the way the story was written, I really didn't enjoy. So while there were some interesting ideas and techniques used in that story, it wasn't one of the ones that I really liked. It seemed like a worser version of Emergency Skin by N.K. Jemisin. That is a short sci-fi fiction. That book was really strong, but it had a similar premise of you being the main character and someone explaining what was going on to you through a electronic means. The next story that I read was In Kind by Kayla Whaley, and this follows a young girl who is severely disabled and wheelchair bound. She has limited mobility and abilities, but she is mentally sound. And when her father tries to murder her, a young vampire in the town rescues her. This is all about how our young main character, Grace, deals with the betrayal of her father and how she views herself as a disabled person and how the world views disabled people. This is definitely one with like a heavy message similar to the previous one, but this one was just more interesting, more interestingly written. It also has a little bit of mixed media in that it's told partly in newspaper articles, and I thought this one was one of the more creepy ones, along with the Rebecca Rowanhauer story. These both have some horror and some vengeance in them. So that was the last one I've read so far. The next story I have is the one by the editors, including this one. I only have 5 more to go. So these seem like they're going to be a little bit longer because this is about halfway through the book. And then there is an afterwards also from the editors and a few pages of about the authors, which I've already read most of. I liked the about the authors section because it talks about the author's favorite vampires. What book did you get for TBR Tackle in November? Let me know in the comments below. Or tell me what your favorite vampire book is. Next thing, right? Next best thing.
Ships. Literally nothing?
Yeah, it's just empty.
Shipyard.
I've read quite a few more stories out of Vampires Never Get Old. I'm actually on the last story. After we last spoke, I read the short story Vampires Never Say Die by the 2 editors of the book. This one was about a vampire who has lived for a very long time. She's sort of the queen of New York vampires. She's super old and ancient, and she sets a lot of the rules that New York vampires have to follow, but she's extremely lonely and isolated, and to reach out, she starts an Instagram, and she has one particular follower who she becomes deeply connected with, and this is the story about how they eventually meet up. I like this one. It has an interesting political aspect to it, which I think is part of the vampire mythos and the idea of vampires having to have or needing to have a hierarchy because of the potential dangers that they face and the potential dangers that the world faces from vampires. The next story was Bestiary by Laura Ruby, and I really like this story. It's about a young vampire who lives at a zoo, and it takes place in a future where water is scarce everywhere, and the water scarcity has impacted everyone, even the animals living at the zoo. But is it because of environmental reasons, or is it a government consumerism ploy to get the people to follow their rules? So I really like this one. With a short story, I guess you know it's going to have a sting or a twist or a surprise at the end. And I think one thing that a lot of these stories have is an ending that's ambiguous, which I really, really enjoy. I like a short story that leaves you wondering what's going to happen next and knowing that you'll never find out. The next story was not my favorite. It was called Mirrors, Windows, and Selfies by Mark Oshiro, and this one was about a young vampire who was born, not made, and how his parents whisk him away to a secret place and tell him his whole life all these rules that he has to have and has to follow, and that all vampires are looking for him, and that if they ever find him, he'll be killed and his parents will be killed. But he feels that there's something that they're holding back, and one day when he finally escapes their watchful eye, he sees another vampire and wonders if this could be the answers to the questions he's been asking, but his parents won't tell him. I didn't love this one because it really dragged, but it's interesting that this one was another one that the framing narrative is all done in like blog posts. Again, we have that idea of an isolated vampire using technology to reach out to the world and as a way to be able to say who they are, tell their story with the protection, maybe misled assumption of protection by the autonomy of the internet. The penultimate story was by Danielle Clayton, and this was called The House of the Black Sapphires. This is another one that has to do with vampire hierarchy, and it deals with Eternals, which in Clayton's story are not quite vampires, but definitely not human. They share more traits with vampires than they would do with humans, but there's some other magic there that creates them to be different than regular vampires. And this is about a family of Eternals who are returning to the maternal homeland, all about her daughters and how her daughters, some of them have lived for hundreds of years and they want to strike out on their own. When we get to the mother's alternate New Orleans home, we find out that she may be a more powerful figure of the Eternals than her daughters ever really realized. Again, it has that hierarchy and machination of vampire myth, vampire lore, and like how different magics work. I also, of course, loved that part of it was set in New Orleans and an alternate New Orleans where there are different wards, which is what they call the different sections of New Orleans, that are beyond the veil, that are different than the human wards, and they also have different areas where different mythical or supernatural creatures live. We're on to the last story, and that is First Kill by Victoria V.E. Schwab. I've never read any V.E. Schwab, so I am interested to read that. Overall, so far, I'm a little bit bored with the YA nature of it. I like the different looks at vampires, but you know, at the heart of a YA story, it's always going to be an angsty young adult. That part of it is getting a little bit repetitive and tedious for me personally. I've enjoyed this book, and parsing it out and not reading it all together has definitely helped me enjoy it. I don't think it's the kind of thing that I could have read back to back to back to back.
You did it? That's what you're saying? No. Confessing to that right now? This old guy?
Like, no one else is as matching as we are.
I finished the last story, and it's a dual perspective of the same 2 days where a teenage vampire and a teenage slayer decide to interact for the first time. Like all short story collections or anthologies, there was definitely some ones in this that I liked and some ones that I didn't. There were some stories that you could tell were better written and more experienced writers, and some that weren't, some that had a more distinctive style, and some that seemed like they were trying things out. I liked the V.E. Schwab story, but it wasn't my favorite. I think my favorite stories are Seven Nights for Dying by Tessa Gratton, In Kind by Kayla Whaley, and Bestiary by Laura Ruby were my favorites. I also really like the story by Rebecca Rowanhorse, The Boys from Blood River, and there were a couple of other ones that I enjoyed as well, but those were my favorites. I'm definitely happy to have read this, and it's good to dip my toe into YA and remember that I don't particularly like YA. But I do love vampires, and I do want to read, and I love to read all vampire books. It's quite a few days before the end of the month, so I won't be picking my final TBRtackle book for a little while. When I see Kieran's video pop up, I will definitely stop back in with you, and we can pick my last TBRtackle 2022 book together.
Down too. Oh no, she gave him like a big ball.
Are you recording her?
No.
You should.
I was recording the pigeons.
Yeah, what do you do in that situation? Would you think he just like blow your stomach up? Yeah. Somebody was laughing about that. It was like those bro-ish guys we were working with whenever I went to
Oh my god, that's horrible.
Longdon Elliott is. He's like a chef, a celebrity chef, but like that's not, I don't there with my boss. He was shooting a movie or trying to shoot.
It's December 3rd, and we haven't gotten a video from Kieran about the last TBRtackle yet. Based on the last few videos that he posted, he is prioritizing other things than booktube, and of course we don't mind. But that means that we are left to our own devices to pick the last book. Now, technically, my last book on my TBRtackle is Long Division by Kisi Lehmann, but I had also had What Are You Going Through by Sigrid Nunez on my TBRtackle list for quite a long time. And I think I'm actually going to read this one. So in true TBRtackle fashion, I am not going to read the book that was actually on my list, and I'm going to pick a different book. In December, I will be reading What Are You Going Through by Sigrid Nunez. Let me know if you've been participating in TBRtackle this year. Let me know what your favorite book out of the 11 months that you've already read are. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!